Welcome back to Shifting Veils. Today we're going to talk about a time in American history when axe murders were so prevalent that newspapers called them a plague. A dark season when the most ordinary tool in the American home became the symbol of fear. But before we step into that story, we need to talk about another household object that had its own moment of grim fame. Another tool that for a brief window in time left its fingerprints on so many violent deaths that reporters began to recognize the pattern. Not a weapon, not something forged for harm, just a flat iron.
In the late 1800s and early 1900s, the same era when axes were carving their way into headlines, the heavy cast iron clothes iron became an unexpected instrument of murder across the South, the Midwest, and the crowded boarding houses of America's growing cities. These irons weighed 5 to 10 pounds, lived on the stove, and were handled daily by women, servants, and boarders. They were part of the background hum of domestic life. And yet, for a few decades, they appeared again and again in coroners' reports and courtrooms. Newspapers even had a name for it: the Iron Murders. You can see it in glam above on the midway. The Iron Murders. In 1893 in Washington, Georgia, Martha Williams killed her abusive husband with a flat iron, and the Atlanta Constitution noted it as another of the iron murders, as if readers already knew the category. In 1902, in Cleveland, boarding house keeper Mary McKeon struck a tenant with an iron still warm from the stove. She didn't want to waste that heat. The plain dealer remarked on the familiarity of the weapon in domestic assaults. In 1909, in Birmingham, Lula Kemp was arrested for killing her employer's wife with a flat iron, a case that spread through Southern papers, many of which commented on the now common use of the household iron in sudden quarrels. And in 1911, in Kansas City, a man named James McBride was killed in a saloon with a flat iron kept near the stove for pressing linens. The Kansas City Star reported the weapon with a kind of weary recognition. These weren't connected crimes. They weren't the work of a single killer or a traveling menace. They were simply the result of a tool that was always present, always heavy, and always within reach. A domestic object that, for a brief moment in American history, became a symbol of sudden intimate violence.
And then, almost as quickly as it began, the era ended. Electric irons arrived, lighter, hollow, no longer capable of the same blunt force. The pattern faded. The phrase iron murder disappeared from the papers. But the story remains tucked into the same shadowed corner of American history as the axe murder plague. A reminder that the home is never neutral, and the tools we live with can become part of the darker stories we tell about ourselves. And now, with that in mind, let's step into the better known chapter, the one where the axe became the most feared object in the American household. And as strange as that flat irons moment was, as unsettling as it is to realize how a simple tool of domestic labor could leave its mark on so many deaths, it was only the prelude to something larger, something that spread wider, struck more fear, and carved itself into the American imagination in a way few patterns of violence ever have. Because while the flat iron had its brief, brutal season, the axe had an era when the tool every family kept by the woodpile became the centerpiece of headlines from New Orleans to Kansas, from Texas to Colorado. An era when entire neighborhoods slept with their doors barred and their windows nailed shut. When newspapers didn't just report the killings, they warned of them. When the word axe alone was enough to send a shiver through a town. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the United States was a nation built on wood. Wood-heated homes, wood-fueled stoves, wood-framed barns, fences, and the skeletons of new towns rising along rail lines. And because of that, nearly every household, rural or urban, kept an axe or hatchet within arm's reach. It was as common as a broom. as unremarkable as a kitchen pot. But in the decades between the 1870s and early 1910s, that ordinary tool became tied to something else. A wave of murders so brutal, so inexplicable, and so often unsolved that newspapers began calling it an epidemic. This is a story of the American axe murder era, when fear traveled faster than rail lines, when entire families vanished overnight, and when the simplest household tool became a symbol of dread.
After the Civil War, the United States entered a period of rapid expansion. Railroads cut through farmland. New towns appeared almost overnight. Families lived in small wooden houses with thin walls and no locks strong enough to stop a determined intruder. Electricity was rare. Streetlights were rarer. More rare. Most rare? Most towns went completely dark after sundown. Nighttime was a different world. It was quiet, unpoliced, and vulnerable. Because wood was the primary fuel source, axes were everywhere. They were propped by back doors, left on porches, stuck in chopping blocks, carried by travelers. They were stored in barns, easy access for everybody. They were not considered weapons, they were tools of survival. And that ubiquity mattered. It meant a killer didn't need to bring anything with them. They could simply walk into a yard, pick up the family's axe, and step inside.
In rural America, locking your door was often seen as unnecessary or even rude. Neighbors trusted one another. Travelers sometimes slept in barns without asking. Communities were small, and everyone knew everyone else. This trust created the perfect conditions for a certain kind of crime: silent, opportunistic, and devastating. One of the earliest widely reported axe murders in the U.S. involved Frances Silver, a young woman in North Carolina known by her friends as Frankie. Frankie was convicted of killing her husband, Charles Silver, with an axe in 1831. The case became infamous because it involved a woman perpetrator, which was rare. The evidence was circumstantial, and the trial reflected the era's limited forensic methods. Frankie Silver was executed in 1833. Her case lingered in public memory, but it was seen as an isolated tragedy, not part of a pattern. Off the coast of Maine, two Norwegian immigrant women, Karen and Aneth Christensen, were killed on Smutty Nose Island. One was strangled, the other was killed with an axe. Louis Wagner, a fisherman, was convicted and executed. This case captured national attention because it happened in a remote, quiet place where violence seemed impossible. It planted an early seed of fear. Even the most peaceful communities were not immune.
And in Nebraska, Stephen D. Richards murdered a mother and her 3 children with an axe. He later confessed to multiple killings across the Midwest. Newspapers called him a modern monster. But again, he was treated as an individual aberration. Still, these cases, scattered across decades, began forming a pattern in the public imagination. The axe as a weapon of sudden intimate destruction. By the 1890s, the United States was changing fast. Railroads connected towns that had once been isolated. People traveled more, strangers passed through more often, and newspapers, cheap, sensational, and competitive, began reporting violent crimes with increasing detail. Historians point to several overlapping factors as to why axe murders soared. Axes were available everywhere. As we stated earlier, they were everywhere. Forensic science was minimal. Fingerprinting wasn't widely used in the US until the 1900s. Police forces were small and undertrained, like a lot of them are now. Railroads allowed killers to move quickly between towns. If not riding on the train, they just walked the rails into the next town because they were just straight lines to them. Newspapers amplified fear often linking unrelated crimes. The funny thing about saying that, though, I feel like, and correct me if I'm wrong with this, is newspapers amplified fear, often linking unrelated crimes. But how much more honest were newspapers back then than they are now?
Oh, I think they were more honest back then. I think they
Right.
just reported the news, not
So
opinion.
I don't know if it was maybe it was an accidental amplifying of fear, but I don't feel like that was like a direct uh cause that they were looking to do, you know?
I don't feel like they needed to purposely sensationalize anything. I think it was quite sensational in
Mhm.
and of itself. And being able to have access to that news, and have that knowledge of these things happening, that wasn't like for it to be more widely available, that wasn't like something that had been around for a terribly long time. Like you said, everything was developing.
Mhm.
So news is spreading faster. It's not probably being taken from town to town on horseback. You know,
Yeah,
maybe.
yeah, no, newspapers if a town is doesn't have their own newspaper running, then I mean they have, reporters and
Yeah,
I'm sure there were very investigative reporters back then too, writing by train, going by telegram,
yeah.
they're working the system the way they can work it at the time just like they do now.
So I
So,
think that they were being. I don't think they were trying to sensationalize anything. I think they were being honest about
yeah.
stuff.
And realistically, linking the murders together would probably be a common thing to do because it's the same weapon. I mean, the brain would link that together, be like, "Oh, there's something there. There's something there. There's got to be something there. What's causing them to do this one thing with this one weapon?"
I think that's a common human trait to
Mhm.
be a lumper, where you lump ideas
Mhm.
together or things together. So you have this handful of murders in this town and a handful in this town and a community in between, and they're all done the same way. So now you think you've got a murderer that's traveling from town to town committing these murders.
Mhm.
The only way to tell the difference is if they happened in two different towns on the same night at the same time, then obviously it's not the same one. But otherwise, you're going to try to lump it
Mhm.
together.
Yeah.
I think that's just human nature.
Yeah. And this created the impression of a roaming killer, as we were just talking about, or multiple killers moving silently across the country. Between the 1890s and 1912, a series of family murders occurred across states like Kansas, Colorado, Illinois, Illinois, and Missouri. Missouri. Many involved the entire household being killed at night, and by the family's own acts. The mirrors were covered, or the windows were. Lamps with chimneys removed to dim the light, and killers who vanished without a trace. There's nothing left behind aside from the dead bodies. These similarities led some investigators to suspect a single perpetrator, though no definitive link was ever proven.
One of the most infamous unsolved crimes in American history happened in Villisca, Iowa on June 10th, 1912. 8 people were killed in their beds: Josiah and Sarah Moore, their 4 children, 2 visiting girls, Lena and Ina Stillinger. The killer used the family's axe. Documented facts include that all victims were bludgeoned while asleep. Mirrors and windows were covered. The killer stayed in the house long enough to prepare food. The axe was left at the scene, and the house was not locked. The crime scene was compromised when townspeople entered the house before authorities arrived. Multiple suspects were investigated over the years, including a traveling minister, a state senator, a known serial killer named Henry Lee Moore, no relation to the family, but no one was ever convicted. The case received national coverage. It crystallized the public's fear that a serial killer might be traveling by rail, striking families at random. Whether or not that was true, the idea took hold. Though slightly later than the main wave, the Axeman of New Orleans became one of the most famous axe-related crime sprees in U.S. history. The attacks occurred between May 1918 and October 1919. Victims were Italian American grocers and their families. Entry was often gained by chiseling through a door panel. The killer used the victims' own axes or straight razors. Some victims survived. A letter attributed to the Axeman was published in newspapers, though its authenticity is debated. New Orleans was already a city steeped in superstition, folklore, and cultural blending. The Axeman attacks intensified existing fears about outsiders, ethnic tensions, supernatural explanations, and the fragility of safety in a crowded city. The attacks stopped abruptly in 1919, and no one was ever identified.
See, and that's one of those things that I would think that, like you were saying, like as a human, we would lump things together because there's
Mm-hmm.
a lot of commonality between like the MO altogether.
Yeah, I know. I know somebody that writes that has a blog that covers some of the same type topics that our podcast does, and they were looking into the New Orleans axe murder, and he really dug in and gotten some information, but then it just kind of blew up too big because it's also during the axe murder era in general, where you have these axe murders all over various states in the country. So it was just, it was hard to say it was one person.
Mm-hmm.
Um, or even that the axe murderer was any different than the one that was in Illinois or Missouri. Um, I do, I personally felt like it was several different people. I think that axe murders at the time were very opportunistic murders. It could have been someone that went in and murdered a family and never did that sort of thing ever again, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Or it could be somebody that was a career criminal and did it several times. There's no way of knowing because it was such a crime of convenience, with doors just being unlocked and windows open and axes laying around. I mean,
I'm so I mean, where my brain would go with any of this is, I agree. So like it's a wide span of like locations and stuff like that, but like everything is very similar. Like the whole
mhm.
MO, like I was saying, is very similar. There's the Italian American families, they're grocers, everything kind of lines up together and everything like that. So like now, whenever we see stuff like this, but it's like widespread where it couldn't just be one person. It's usually some sort of grouping. So I would agree. Like we mentioned that earlier too. And so I would feel like maybe it was a group of people that had kind of, I like the word colluded together to some degree,
Mhm.
like a cult sort of thing. I'm sure cults happened just as much back then as they do now. They're just more open and public now.
I don't know. I don't know if I could hop on that train. I do feel like there was probably a lot of copycat stuff going on.
Mm-hmm.
I do feel like the axe murder of New Orleans sets itself aside just a little bit because of the targets, yeah, being the demographic that they were.
Mm-hmm.
It was specific. And then the fact that they had sent a letter in,
Yeah.
because none of the others, as far as I could find, had sent a letter in. And none of the others really were specific about who it was they were killing.
Yeah.
So I do feel like the axe murders of New Orleans were a little bit different. That's not to say that whoever was responsible for that traveled to Kansas and did it there
Mm-hmm.
too. You
No, yeah.
know, I mean, they could have, and maybe they just didn't get what they wanted by the way they did things in New Orleans, so they didn't do it that way in Kansas.
Sure.
Who knows?
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, it's all theories regardless because we don't
mhm.
have anything to like hard, no
And nobody
hard
got caught.
proof. Yeah. So, but yeah, I was just kind of theorizing, throwing that out there. That's
Well, that would be big,
cults.
though. That would be
I,
big if it was a group of people doing it and it was like a society.
see, it's I have. I have issues when it comes to cults. Like I have a fascination with cults and stuff like that, and the mindset people get into, and the ease of like the brainwashing a situation where they can influence somebody to see something as a right way of doing it. And so
Yeah.
it's like I don't know, the cult of the axe.
Right.
By the 1920s, several changes reduced the prevalence of axe murders. Electric lights made nighttime intrusions riskier. More people moved into cities with police forces, street lights lighting the streets, neighbors close enough to hear disturbances. Yeah, because paper thin walls,
Yeah.
better locks, and home construction doors became sturdier. Windows became harder to force open. There were advances in forensic science, so fingerprints, crime scene preservation, and centralized record keeping improved dramatically. As wood burning declined, axes became less common household tools. Gas and electric stoves replaced wood stoves, and coal and oil replaced firewood. The tool that had once been everywhere slowly faded from daily life. And now everybody's trying to bring it back. 'Cause you see all the TikToks and all the Instagram videos, all the social media of people swinging their axes. They're all like, "Look at this, I can do it." There's women that do it. There's men that do it. They're showing up. They're wearing the skimpiest clothing. Even the men, they're all swinging. They're all oiled up and they're swinging these axes and they're chopping all the wood. They're bringing the axe back.
I hope not. Not in that regard. But yeah, I've seen it. I mean, some people still chop wood. Some people have fireplaces. Some people live in the hills, you know.
I enjoyed chopping wood. When I chopped wood, I enjoyed chopping wood. It's actually a pretty good exercise.
I'm sure it is. The axe murder wave left a lasting imprint on American culture. It shaped early true crime reporting. It influenced folklore and urban legends. It created the archetype of the night prowling killer. It exposed the vulnerabilities of a rapidly changing nation. But most importantly, it revealed something about the era itself, a time when America was expanding faster than its institutions could keep up, when darkness still ruled the night, and when the simplest tool could become a symbol of terror. The X murder era wasn't a single event, it wasn't a single killer. It was a convergence of circumstance, a nation in transition, a tool in every yard, and a darkness that settled over towns unprepared for the violence that sometimes walked among them. And though the era ended more than a century ago, its echoes remain in the stories we tell, the fears we inherit, and the quiet truth that safety is always a fragile thing. In the end, the axe murder era wasn't defined by a single killer or a single place. It was a moment in American history when the country was growing faster than its safeguards, when darkness still pooled in the corners of every unlit room, and when the tools of daily survival could be turned against the very people who relied on them. Families slept behind thin walls. Doors stood unlocked because trust was the currency of small towns. Rail lines stitched the nation together, but they also carried strangers who could vanish as quickly as they arrived. And in that fragile space between progress and vulnerability, fear took root, not the supernatural kind, though people certainly whispered about that too, but the fear of the ordinary, the fear of the tool leaning by the back door, the fear of the quiet footsteps on a wooden porch, the fear that safety was never as solid as it seemed. The era faded as electricity spread, as locks strengthened, as police forces modernized, and as axes slowly disappeared from everyday life. But the stories remain, etched into newspaper archives, court records, and the collective memory of towns that still remember.
If this history stirred something in you, curiosity, unease, questions about how people lived through times like these, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Tell me Tell us what part of this era surprised you, or what echoes you see in the world today. Share your own family stories, regional legends, or the ways your community talks about danger and safety. Your experiences and reflections help shape where we go next.
Drop a comment, send a message, or join the conversation on our socials. And if you want more deep dives into the strange, the historical, and the quietly unsettling corners of American life, make sure you're following the show so you don't miss what comes next. Because the past isn't gone, it's just waiting for someone to knock on its door.